Welcome back, everyone, to the show. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Please hit the like button as you come on. We have an incredible show for you today. We are going to talk about all of these escalations leading to a third world war. Donald Trump is rapidly torpedoing any chance of peace in Ukraine, if there was ever a chance at all beyond total Russian victory. 2 Ohio-class submarines are now parked somewhere in the region near Russia on Trump's orders following a social media spat with former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Russia has an answer. Its name is Oreshnik, the missile that is, as well as a firm position to move forward on the battlefield with increasing vigor and effectiveness. Meanwhile, another chapter in the U.S. war on rising multipolar nations in the global majority is being opened as China prepares its own defensive maneuvers along with Russia in the Pacific as a larger war with China looms. With all of this said, we are going to discuss all of it and more with two very good friends of the show, Brian Berletic of the New Atlas and KJ No. I wanted to play and talk about this escalation on the part of the Trump administration. Okay. So Donald Trump has sent 2 Ohio-class submarines somewhere close to Russia. We don't know where, but this is what he said on a right-wing media, Finnerty, about the situation.
Former president of Russia, who's now in charge of one of the most important councils, Medvedev, said some things that were very bad, talking about nuclear. And when you mention the word nuclear, I say, my eyes light up and I say, we better be careful because it's the ultimate threat. He shouldn't have said it. He's got a fresh mouth. He said things in the past too. And so we always want to be ready. And so I have sent to the region 2 nuclear submarines. I just want to make sure that his words are only words and nothing more than that.
Yes. Well, also in this escalation, we have to get to some of the context. This is what Donald Trump was referencing, this spat with Dmitry Medvedev. This is what Medvedev wrote on Telegram. He said about India's, we'll just go to the third paragraph, it's the most important, India's and Russia's dead economies entering very dangerous territory. Well, let Trump remember his favorite movies about Walking Dead, as well as how dangerous the fabled dead hand can be, referencing a nuclear escalation doctrine on the part of Russia. So before I get to the whole Oreshnik situation, Brian, your initial reactions to what's going on when it comes to Ukraine vis-a-vis Trump, as Donald Trump himself imposes ultimatums on Russia, or attempts to, and threatens nuclear war.
Well, this was all about continuity of agenda. This was, what I had said before he even was elected president. I said that all of this is going to continue. There is a single agenda, and the only thing that changes are the lies that are used to sell the agenda to the public and the excuses made for why things are not changing despite campaign promises otherwise. And so what we see President Trump doing right now is making excuses and just outright lying about why this war continues. This war he said he was going to stop in 24 hours. And people said, well, that's not even realistic. He couldn't do that if he wanted to. But in reality, this is a war between the United States and Russia being fought in and through Ukraine. Again, the New York Times reported this. This isn't me saying this or Russia saying this. The New York Times admitted from 2014 onward, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency took control over all of Ukraine's intelligence agencies. And from 2022 onward, U.S. generals have been at the top of the chain of command of Ukraine's armed forces. So this is literally being fought and overseen and organized and planned by the United States. And all the U.S. president has to do is say, I'm bringing the generals home, the CIA is out, and then the war is over. And he literally could make this decision in one day, and then it would be over. And what he's trying to do right now is just freeze the conflict. And I warned people, if you listen carefully, even during the campaign, This was what he was saying. This is what J.D. Vance was saying. This is what everyone else he had around him during campaign season. This is what they were saying. They were saying, we shouldn't be sending weapons to Ukraine because we need them to go fight China. So it's not ending war. It's just creating a bigger war. But then there was always the caveat that we are going to dump this conflict on Europe. So we're not ending it. We're at best going to try to freeze it because we're losing it right now, as you alluded to earlier, Danny. And we are going to continue this, but through Europe. And as I constantly repeat, this is about division of labor, which is a term U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth used back in February, division of labor. And this is also about strategic sequencing. The U.S. cannot fight Russia, China, and Iran all at the same time. So they need to do it in turn. And so this is what we're watching. And what we're watching is Biden policy being sold under the MAGA/America First marketing slogans. That's all this is.
Yeah, KJ, your assessment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Brian. There's a very clear continuity of agenda. People think that it's chaos or consolidation, but no, it's clearly a continuity. And so this is what makes things, extraordinarily dangerous. The thing about the submarines, I think it's important to point out, this is rhetorical posturing, but even rhetorical posturing is dangerous because it signals that you're moving up the escalation ladder. The signals themselves are part of the escalation ladder. Just so that we understand, the Ohio-class submarine, let's assume that it's SSBN, ballistic missile launching Ohio-class submarine. Each one of them carries 24 Trident II missiles. These Trident II missiles have a range between 7,600 kilometers to 12,000 kilometers. So just the fact that Trump is saying that I'm placing them closer actually doesn't mean very much, because they're designed to launch intercontinental missiles. But again, the firepower that they have is each Trident, if you consider that it has 24, that it will be carrying 24 Trident missiles, each one which has 8 475 kiloton warheads, then you're looking something in the range of about 91,000 kilotons that a single submarine can launch. That is to say, the equivalent of 6,000 Hiroshimas. If you have two of them that are being signaled right now, that's 12,000 Hiroshimas right there. So in other words, this is an extraordinarily foolish threat to be making. And it's not simply, trolling or, posturing, because these kinds of messaging push you further up the escalation ladder. And it's, and with Trump's mindset, where he has said himself that about nuclear weapons, what do you mean we can't use them? Meaning that he thinks that, it's permissible to use these things. So it's just an extraordinarily dangerous situation. And it ties into the fact that the US is continuing to escalate to war, to world war. And I believe that it is fully capable of using nuclear weapons.
Yeah. And, Brian, I wanted to actually, before we get to Russia's response in a second, I just wanted to show you this because major mainstream media, Western media, are very happy about Donald Trump's posture right now toward Russia, including here on Newsweek. Trump fixed NATO. He can fix, it's about prescription drug prices. But what I found so interesting is that this person was a deputy U.S. trade representative for the first Trump administration. And essentially what he says is he successfully fixed NATO by getting NATO and all European countries in NATO to fall into line. And so I'm curious, Brian, where does this all fit in? Because that's his argument. That is the argument of Jeffrey Jarish, the author of that article. He says that Europe European countries in NATO falling into line, and Trump did that. He fixed NATO, and now NATO is talking about 2027 war with Russia, and Trump is using Twitter spats, spats, social media spats to escalate with Russia. It all points the same direction. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, President Trump's comments and announcement that he's moving these submarines, as KJ pointed out, which is just absurd. It's posturing. It's probably never even happened. These submarines are, again, as KJ pointed out, they're always within reach of U.S. Designated adversaries. But the point is, he's responding to something someone said on X about the dead hand. The dead hand is a system or a method of retaliating against a nuclear strike on Russia. This is what Russia was talking about. If we are attacked, even if you wipe out all of our leadership, we still have this mechanism in place to retaliate with nuclear weapons. So this is what President Trump is reacting to. Something somebody said in defense against constant U.S. warmongering toward Russia. Now, I can prove that President Trump always meant to lie to the American people from the very beginning about ending the conflict in Ukraine, because at the same time he constantly said he was going to end the conflict in 24 hours. He was also saying, I'm going to get NATO to ramp up spending. Every member in NATO is going to spend up to 5% of their GDP on military matters for NATO. Why does NATO exist? NATO exists solely to confront, encroach upon, encircle, contain, and eventually absorb Russia. That is its only purpose for existence. And if Trump is talking about expanding NATO while at the same time claiming he's going to end this war against Russia, he's telling you up front that, no, we're not actually going to end the conflict in Ukraine. I'm telling you what you want to hear. The agenda is to continue this belligerence toward Russia, this encroachment upon Russia, the encirclement and containment of Russia, and this constant threat to Russia that obviously Russia is going to respond to. So even during campaign season, he was telling you this was never going to end. It was only going to escalate. If you're telling NATO members you need to spend more on NATO, it's because you need NATO to do more what? To do more confrontation toward Russia. So again, people have to listen carefully to what is actually being said instead of just hearing what they want to hear. So it's blatant. It's blatant. I think a lot of people have woken up. I think more people still need to wake up. And unfortunately, people who have invested in President Trump, especially Americans who have invested in President Trump, he can do no wrong in their mind. And in their mind, they just constantly tell themselves, well, maybe that's not really what I voted for, but at least it's not Kamala Harris. At least it's not Biden. When in reality, it is. It's just continuity of agenda with President Trump selling it instead of somebody else.
KJ, a lot of this seems to point to the Trump administration's deep commitment to trying to dictate terms, not only to Russia, but the entire multipolar world. And while some in the United States may have had expectations about what Donald Trump would do with regard to Ukraine and so-called peace, which is completely being burst asunder by both his words and deeds, Vladimir Putin, I'll just play this on mute because it's in Russian with captions. I'll read it for all of you. Let me just speed it up a bit. This is what he said when he was with Viktor Lukashenko of Belarus about negotiations with the U.S. As for any disappointments on anyone's part, all disappointments arise from excessive expectations. This is a well-known general rule. In order to approach the issue in a peaceful manner, it is necessary to have detailed conversations, not in public, but this must be done calmly, in silence in the negotiation process. So Putin spells it out quite firmly there that he didn't, given the way things have gone, he didn't really have huge expectations. And now the situation has changed completely. But KJ, your comments.
Yeah, so I think Putin is showing himself as the measured and skilled statesman he is. He's pointing out both, philosophically and pragmatically, expectations need to be managed. And I think this is a message both to his domestic audience, the international audience, as well as the White House. I think that it's pretty clear that, whatever hope that people were deluding themselves around de-escalation is no longer, possible. I think that, as Brian has pointed out, we are looking at continuity of agenda. We're looking at division of labor. We're looking at strategic sequencing. That said, once again, we have to understand the US political system for what it is. Each time we have a new president, they each come in saying and promising the moon, and most notably, always promising to end wars. I mean, this was true for Nixon. It's true for Obama. This is why Obama was elected. I mean, within days, he received the Nobel Prize for peace, Nobel Peace Prize, right? Of course, it's completely unwarranted. Same thing for Trump. He was elected on an anti-war platform because the desire for people, which is completely, rational, is for peace. People want peace. They want stable lives so they can go ahead and try to build decent lives for themselves and their families. And when you have war, that destroys everything. And of course, we have the warmonger class, which, as far as I can tell, seems dead set on war, on global war. And we're looking at the four horsemen of capitalism. We're looking at deindustrialization. We're looking at financialization. We're looking at de-skilling. And we're looking at internal contradictions that can only be dealt with by escalating to kinetic war. This is the reset button for a failing system. It's the wall defibrillator that you use when the capitalist beast, has gone into cardiac arrest. You start the war machine. And this is what I'm very, very afraid of. And this is what everything seems to be pointing towards.
Yeah. And Brian, your comments on Russia's, how Russia has responded here, because throughout the duration of this, we haven't seen Russia budge on their demands. We haven't seen them even give an inch. There isn't even any whiff of normalization. Forget the conflict itself. Your thoughts about how Russia has responded to all of this, because still Steve Witkoff is going to have come and gone from Russia very soon. And no one is expecting any kind of quote unquote breakthrough, because the song and dance is the same. It's the US going in and saying, do what we say. This is what we want from you. Exactly what you said earlier, Brian. We want a ceasefire. We want to freeze. Your thoughts?
Exactly. For Russia, it's existential. This is a war being waged against Russia by the United States. It's not even just being waged against Russia through Ukraine, but through all of Europe and through all of these so-called allies. I think more accurately to call them proxies of the United States, client states of the United States. And this is what they're responding to. So if they were to agree to a ceasefire, essentially freezing the conflict, all they're doing is giving the collective West time and space to rearm, to reorganize Ukraine's military, to reorganize Europe's military, because they're getting online to go in next. We see them making the preparations. And it would knock the wind out of Russia's momentum that they have, and the advantage that they have in terms of military industrial production. This is something that I think people are somewhat complacent. They think that there's no possible way for the U.S. to catch up, and in a lot of ways, it's difficult for them to catch up. But every single year, they're working on it a little bit more each year. And you don't have forever to fight this war. So Russia needs to end this. They need to end it on their terms. If it is frozen, it will end up like Syria, a conflict everybody thought was concluded, or at least stalemated, but in favor of Syria and its allies, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. But we saw how the United States reorganized the terrorist proxies it was using, how it used nations like Turkey and Israel, and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all of these nations to recalibrate their support for these terrorists. And when the opportunity availed itself, they they took it, they completely overthrew and collapsed Syria as a functioning nation state. And so this is what Russia is looking at if they were to capitulate to these demands. And what the United States is doing right now, they're not looking for peace. They want to freeze it. They want to coerce Russia into accepting a freeze so that they can create the conditions later on where they could succeed where they are currently failing. If you look at the map on the ground in Ukraine, Russian forces just took Chasiv Yar. They are on the doorstep of Seversk, and they have entered into Kupiansk. They've surrounded Pokrovsk, which is all of these are extremely heavily fortified areas along the line of contact. Yep, that is Pokrovsk right there. There's reports that Russian forces are operating across the city. We've been hearing this for weeks, and the Ukrainians are saying, well, it's normal. You just get a couple of these sabotage teams, but it's every single day. So it's more than just that. And the logistics have been complicated. And once that happens, everything starts to accelerate. And this is what Russia has done to all of these major cities. And Ukraine has not been able to stop Russia even one time. Once this process begins, inevitably the city will fall and everything will move even further west. And if you look at the map, you see that Ukraine is running out of cities to hide in until they reach the Dnieper River. So this is significant. This is why we see panic across the West, and especially in Washington, who ultimately engineered this proxy war and is worried about losing it.
Yeah, and KJ, perhaps you can build on that, because as Brian was talking, there are these significant battlefield achievements by Russia of late. Chasiv Yar, as he mentioned, Pokrovsk is just an absolute mess for Ukraine and the U.S. Then there's also the political situation for Ukraine is very unstable. Talks of a kind of internal regime change scenario likely coming in the very near future. There just seems to be mounting problems, and just the way that Donald Trump is behaving is showing that when there is an unfavorable situation in front of the war machine, it regresses to the mean. KJ, your final thoughts on this?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is, it's so repeated so often that it's starting to become trite. But Kissinger said that it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, and it is lethal, it is deadly to be an ally. And this is exactly the same thing that we see happening for Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky was a corrupt clown of, a potentate. You put a clown in power, you are going to get a circus. But what he was supposed to do was he was supposed to take direction cleanly, and the U.S. never imagined that Ukraine would not win. Russia is a gas station, right? They were just going to roll over it. It was just an appetizer on the way to the main course, which was China. And so now that he is losing, they want to get rid of him, just as they got rid of Diem, that they got rid of Syngman Rhee, they got rid of Park Chung-hee. All of these dictators that the US puts into power, when they become losers, and Trump hates nothing. There's nothing that Trump hates more than a loser. Once they become losers, they become expendable, and they need to change them out. We know that, there are people waiting in the wings, and all of this signals that the US, the West, knows that they're losing on the battlefields. They're trying to see if they can get some kind of a rebrand on the political sphere, and see if they can stoke up their vassals and get them to re-engage in war. But ultimately, it is a lost war. This is a war of attrition, depends on industrial capacity. And as we've said many, many times before, if you deindustrialize, you not only are you deindustrializing, but you're also de-skilling. If you've done that, then it's very, very hard to recover that. The problem is that the United States is led by a generation of military leaders that have not engaged in protracted industrial war for at least 2 generations. And so they are completely unmoored. They don't understand what they're doing. They're still relying on Israeli war doctrine, which came out of the Yom Kippur War, which then was the basis of the US's air-land battle, which is also the basis for the anti-war doctrine air-sea battle. And this is based on rapid decapitation strikes. It is not about protraction or industrial warfare. And they simply are not capable of understanding that the situation has changed. And once again, if that happens, then what is the ace in the hole that they will reach for? Do they actually have the capacity to freeze it? Are they going to resort to nuclear threats? Well, they already are.
So, well, let's get to this. Let's get to another aspect, because usually Russia responds to threats. It responds to escalations in a variety of ways. So let's talk about this. So first, Vladimir Putin was visiting Mr. Lukashenko, Viktor Lukashenko of Belarus, to talk about, in particular, our Oreshnik missiles, which are going to be deployed and stationed in Belarus. And this is what he had to say. Hold on. No, this is not the right one. This is what he had to say regarding this that has the collective West in somewhat of a major state of alarm. Here's what he said.
The first thing I wanted to say in this connection, we have already manufactured the first serial production Oreshnik missile complex, and it's already been fielded.
So the Oreshnik missile is now mass produced. It is fielded. And that, of course, given the test that occurred last year and how much that frightened the West and the power of that missile, that has caused some great panic. But then a Russian lawmaker had this to say in particular about the nuclear submarine threat. Viktor Vodolatsky responded to Donald Trump's nuclear submarine threat, the movement of nuclear submarines to appropriate regions, by saying there are significantly more of our nuclear submarines in the world's oceans, and they have the strongest and most powerful weapons. This is why Trump's 2 boats, let them float. They have been at gunpoint for quite a long time. So very strong words. I mean, this moment is very reminiscent of the Cold War. It's a very kind of new Cold War-like moment where we have Russia gearing up in a very big way, Brian, for this larger conflict. And Oreshniks are now a part of this. Many people have said, well, this isn't a direct threat. It doesn't really mean much. It doesn't mean Oreshniks are going to be used, but they're available. And that's a big deal for a country like Russia, which is under significant threat right now. What's your thoughts?
Well, this is Russia. Russia has to demonstrate significant deterrence against the United States and its client states, because if they don't, we can see the U.S. will just continue taking and taking and taking. They do this salami slice strategy where they just take just a tiny bit each time, so that it doesn't seem like a big deal, but over time it starts to add up. They've been doing the exact same thing to Iran in the Middle East, and they've done the exact same thing to China in the Asia Pacific. And as a matter of fact, we've already seen the conflict with Iran culminate in open war. And this is exactly how these other conflicts are going to unfold. And the United States honestly believes that eventually it could fight a war against these countries directly. It suspects that it can do this without it escalating to nuclear warfare, or they believe somehow it would be limited nuclear war. And they feel, and maybe there is some truth to this, they're on the other side of the planet. They have oceans between them and everybody else. And so when they are causing all of this murder, mayhem, death, and destruction from one side of Eurasia to the other, they're destroying everything there. And the United States remains untouched on the other side of the planet. The U.S. has its forces spanning the globe, and they're able to project this military power in ways that both Russia and China cannot. Of course, Iran most certainly cannot. And so this does give them an advantage. They see that over time, the trajectory of the rise of multipolarism, the fading of US-led unipolarism, they know that this opportunity isn't going to last forever. So they're trying to take advantage of it now while it lasts. Now, you were talking about the Oreshnik and how these weapons and other weapons have been stationed in Belarus. And what Russia is basically doing is extending protection and essentially almost integrating Belarus into the Russian Federation. Because if they don't do this, the U.S. is going to use its other super weapon that a lot of people don't really seem to talk about or notice that much, and that is America's ability to infiltrate and politically capture a targeted nation. This is what they did to Ukraine, which caused this war in the first place, which short-circuited the Ukrainian people's ability to pursue their own best interests and to essentially commit national suicide. And they openly tried to do this to Belarus many times over the past 2 or 3 decades, since the end of the Cold War, essentially. They are doing this here in the Asia-Pacific region. They've already politically captured Europe. The European Union is essentially an American project, an extension of American policy. People always ask, why is Europe doing this? They're destroying their own economy. Why are they doing this? Because the people in power do not represent or reflect the interest of Europe. They reflect the interest of Washington, who put them there in power. They're doing they want to create the same dynamics here in the Asia-Pacific region. And they've done this in the Middle East to a great degree. They have all kinds of proxies there who are pursuing war and proxy war against their own best interest to serve American hegemony worldwide. So this is the threat that Russia, China, and Iran are faced with, and I would say multipolarism as a whole. And the response to this has to be full spectrum, because the U.S. is waging full spectrum war against them.
Yeah, well, KJ, perhaps assess that in the case of Russia then, because, not only did this Russian lawmaker say straight up that we have our weapons pointed at you, we have our submarines pointed at you, they're more effective. They've been there for quite a long time. But when it comes to the Oreshnik, I mean, this is quite a powerful weapon. And while, yes, the United States, to Brian's point, it has the will. It wants to expand. It wants to move. There's a Russia and China, these countries, they don't want to fight wars of aggression. So what do you make of the overall situation and Russia's response in this context?
Well, once again, I think it's important to highlight that Russia has been very, very measured throughout the war. But the U.S. is pushing the buttons, and they're trying to go as far as they can. So, absolutely, Russians don't want to fight, just like the Chinese don't want to fight. They don't want a war, but they're also signaling that if we need to go up the threshold, if we need to go up the escalation ladder, we will. And the Oreshnik is a very interesting weapon because it is a non-nuclear strategic weapon. That is, it's a weapon that has the force and the destructive capacity of a nuclear weapon, but it is non-nuclear. It works purely from the kinetic energy that it generates in its incredibly rapid hypersonic flight. The US has nothing that can deal with that can challenge that. And even if we were to remove Oreshniks from the picture, we've also seen that the U.S. Missile shield, the U.S. capacity to defend itself, has been tested. It's been thoroughly tested in the recent Israel-Iran war, the 12-day war, and it has been found completely lacking. Let's think about what happened between, in the exchange between Iran and Israel. Well, True Promise 3 was the largest ballistic missile launch in history, 550 missiles. We don't know exactly how many hit, but we know that the battle damage was enough that Israel had to tap out, and that it also is hiding the battle damage. This is currently censored. So whatever happened, we know that it was significant. In this process, we also know that the US threw everything they had against Iran's missile capacity. That is, they brought in Patriots from other theaters. In fact, they said it was the most intense Patriot engagement in the history of the weapon. They brought in the THAAD system. The Israelis themselves had David's Sling, Arrow 2 and 3, and the Iron Dome. So multiple layers of defense systems, and the Russians were able to demolish these with what looked to be largely conventional ballistic missiles. So that sends a very, very strong message to the United States. You no longer have escalation dominance. You no longer have a missile shield. You no longer have impunity in attacking countries with standoff weapons as that they have always had. And if you think of that equation, and then on top of that, you add hypersonics like the Oreshniks, which, as I said, are strategic non-nuclear weapons, then I think that the United States, if it were to think carefully, would say, we need to sue for peace right away. But it's not doing that. It only knows one thing, which is to escalate and to move forward. It doesn't have a reverse gear. It doesn't even have, the neutral, the idle gear is only so that it can go forward again. And so this is a very, very dangerous moment. And we have to understand that, as Brian said, the US will do several other things. It's waging full spectrum war. So as conventional war becomes less and less viable, they will do, the kind of dirty wars, the small wars, the regime change, color revolution operations, creating essentially chaos around the world and certainly all around Asia. And then the other thing that, we know is being prepared are tactical nukes, which Elbridge Colby has been talking about for at least a decade. And then we also know that the information warfare will continue to accelerate. The key strength that the United States has above and beyond any other skill and capacity is its capacity to mystify, indoctrinate, and to wage information war. So once again, we should expect an even greater level of propaganda and indoctrination.
Yeah. Brian, you, as KJ was talking, I was thinking about your prior point about how the United States can't really catch up to Russia. It's trying, but what's such an interesting contradiction for the United States at this time when it comes to developments like the Oreshnik is that it has to, its doctrine has been win wars, quote unquote, quickly, right? Full spectrum dominance and aggression, take out the enemy, quote unquote, as fast as possible, regime change as fast as possible. That is victory. Now with Russia, though, there's a commitment to a long war because that was never really in the cards. And it's a dangerous contradiction when you both have this need to keep the conflict going on the part of the United States, as well as the fact that Russia is going to continue onward, developing its own industrial base, leading to possibly this parallel process between the two of endless conflict. And that seems to be the only choice the U.S. has and is very committed to doing this.
I'd be very careful about underestimating the United States. No, they do not have the industrial power to wage a protracted war of attrition with Russia or China, or even with Iran. We saw the trouble they had in that conflict, as KJ was just pointing out. The problem is the United States fully understands this. They understand that this is a weakness. It's inherent in the system that represents U.S. special interests, is pursuit of power and profit over purpose, the inability to create the state-owned enterprises that would actually facilitate the military power required to seize power, keep power by force, only by force. But see, the United States has cultivated all of these other options. They have tremendous economic power. They're still wielding. I just watched the United States coerce multiple nations in ASEAN here in Southeast Asia into these, I wouldn't even call them trade deals. It was trade concessions and trade coercion. And they're able to do this because of their economic power and all the other non-military instruments of power that the U.S. has perfected over the last several decades. And I keep going back to this ability of the U.S. to infiltrate a country politically in terms of seizing its information space, education, rigging the political system if it's a nation that has a Western-style, quote unquote, democracy. This is a system the U.S. and the British imposed on many of these countries outside of the West, specifically because it allows them to come in, interfere in that system, and create the results each and every single time an election takes place that favors them and their interests at the cost of the interest of the actual country holding these so-called elections. And the United States still has tremendous power over many nations, has outright politically captured all of Europe, Japan, South Korea. It has taken the island province of Taiwan, has politically captured that. This is part of China, but it has been politically captured by the United States. And the United States is working its way into nations where it has varying levels of success here in Southeast Asia. There was this border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. The dynamics there were specifically because the U.S. has influence pretty much over the entire Cambodian government. It's a one-party, single-family government, and they have pivoted hard back toward the United States over the last year or so. And they also have politically captured the political system, information space, and education system here in Thailand. And there is currently a U.S.-backed client regime in power here. And so this is how they're able to get these countries to make concessions, to make agreements, to do things, to pursue policies that serve U.S. interests at their own expense and create these dilemmas for nations like Russia, Iran, and China. These nations are surrounding. These nations are located along their peripheries. This is a super weapon the U.S. has and uses, and this is how it is responding to the reality that it cannot fight an all-out war against Russia and China directly, but it has other ways of pursuing this conflict. I just want to remind people that the whole conflict in Ukraine was never about defeating Russia. It was about extending Russia. There's literally a paper titled "Extending Russia" by the Rand Corporation, published in 2019, that says we want this conflict. We are going to throw Ukraine into this conflict. We know Ukraine will be destroyed, but it will raise the cost for Russia. It will overextend Russia. It will tie up Russia. And this is where strategic sequencing comes in place. If the U.S. just pivoted from Russia to Iran or to China, and it did not create this quagmire to suck Russia into Ukraine, Russia could just pivot and take all of its resources and support Iran or to support China. But because the U.S. has created these dilemmas for Russia and Ukraine, for Iran in across the entire Middle East, and for China in terms of Taiwan and Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, it has locked all of these countries in place, and this is what will allow them to attack and defeat in detail all three of these pillars of multipolarism.
Well, Putin alluded, Brian and KJ, I'll get your response after we play this. Putin alluded to this in his presser with Viktor Lukashenko of Belarus. This is what he said. I'll put it on mute again because it's in Russian. With caption, in the modern world, this has always been important, but today especially, sovereignty plays a particularly key role, one might say, including for economic development. It was clear that the European Union did not have that much sovereignty. Today, it has become obvious that it does not exist at all, and this is immediately followed in the critical situation and economic losses that follow. But KJ, Russia, China, I mean, these countries are championing sovereignty very, very hard, much to Brian's assessment. I think in response to Brian's assessment. So, but your reaction to all of this?
Well, I think, we've had this discussion before. As Brian says, the US's super weapon is information war. It dominates information space and mental space. And it does this because it has had centuries of practice in essentially propaganda. It's marketing, it's propaganda, it's also, religious doctrine. All of these things come together in a way that is very, very powerful that allows them to control and have literally monopoly control over information space. And they also control the hardware as well that allows the access or the dissemination of information. So that is a very, very tough nut to crack. But specifically regarding, the notion of sovereignty, the United States regards any country that asserts its sovereignty as authoritarian. So, for example, China is authoritarian because it upholds its sovereignty. Now, technically, the world system is supposed to be made up of sovereign states. So this is actually, goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia. It's at least 4 centuries old. And certainly it was enshrined in the UN and certainly in the Bandung Principles of sovereignty and non-interference. But all of that has been thrown out the window if it was ever, anything more than window dressing. Specifically in the early 2000s, the US, came forth with a doctrine where they said that sovereignty is contingent. What is it contingent on? Well, they said it's contingent on good governance and human rights. What they really mean is it's contingent on whether you are a good vassal, whether you allow yourselves to be subjugated to the hegemon. And so the US has constructed this entire, vocabulary with which it captures, the global system. As I said, operations mean war, defense means offense, security means hegemony. So anytime the US talks about ensuring security, what they really are talking about is ensuring US hegemony. Anytime they say deter, for example, deter China, what they're really talking about is provoking China. And certainly this notion of sovereignty has been so wiped clean of its original sense because the US has this hegemonic ambition to control all the countries of the world. Now that is slipping away. Clearly, Russia, China, Iran are sovereign states, and as are more and more countries of the global South. But still, the U.S. Ability, the power to compel and to coerce other countries is significant. And as Brian pointed out, we saw this in the ways that they all kind of peeled off and capitulated one by one to Trump's tariffs. I mean, just one example is South Korea, which has agreed to 15% tariffs and $450 billion worth of investment and purchases, of which $350 billion South Korea is committed to invest in the United States. Now, the tricky thing here is that that's about all of South Korea's foreign exchange reserves. In other words, they're going to empty their pockets in order to please or to appease the hegemon. That said, I don't want us to think that everything, is lost and that, it's just one-sided game. Once again, if you look at Korea recently got rid of the US quisling, Yoon Suk-yeol. He was literally, impeached, kicked out. And now they have, a very much more progressive leader who is trying his best, A, not to get couped, and B, to put up some kind of resistance against the empire. If you look at the discussions around geostrategic maneuvering in East Asia, Korea is more and more dropped. The ambitions for Korea seem to be more diminished, and the role of Japan is much more emphasized or accelerated. Most recently, U.S. discussions around, using nuclear weapons with Japan. Taiwan, of course, is, it is the spear point of U.S. ambitions in East Asia. But once again, very recently, they tried to initiate a legislative coup. They were going to recall all the opposition lawmakers who were opposed to their escalation to war. And they were actually thoroughly trounced at the ballot box, which shows that there's considerable resistance on the ground. Right now, the U.S. quisling DPP Taiwan party is reeling, as is the United States itself, because things have not gone according to plan. And of course, Japan has been blowing hot and cold. Ishiba has been going along with the Shinzo Abe agenda, which is, rapid remilitarization. but he has also been a little bit of a loose cannon. He said in the past that, yes, we want to support the United States. We're happy to have US bases on our territory, but as a sovereign state, in terms of reciprocity, we would also like to place Japanese military bases on US sovereign territory. That did not go over well, and it looks like he's going to be, pushed out. But there are contradictions inside the system, and those are the things that we have to look for. We have to look at where the contradictions are, see where there are crevices, and then we have to, expand and allow those contradictions to be visible and present.
Yeah, and I think to both of your points, I think they go very well together. There's for the United States, as its empire really loses the capacity to arrest the development of something like multipolarity, the more desperate it becomes. And the more desperate it becomes, yes, there's a lot of weakness and decline there. But when an empire is backed into a corner, it lashes out as much and as hard as it can. And that's what it is doing now. And that's why, Brian, to your point, not only has the United States has totally its foreign policy has totally come to the conclusion that there is no real quote unquote defeat of Russia beyond continuing this conflict as long as possible, and hoping and seeing if that opens up opportunities in the future that maybe we can't foresee that allows them to get what they want, which is of course the dismemberment of Russia. Any quick thoughts, Brian, and then we can move on.
Yes, I just want to remind people that because Russia was tied up in Ukraine, still is tied up in Ukraine, the United States was able to finally and fully dismember Syria. And then because that was a prerequisite for all-out war on Iran, advance that agenda toward actual war with Iran, which is still ongoing. It's paused. The outright fighting is paused. Everyone on all sides is getting ready for the next round. That is far from finished there. And I want to point out, yes, China has tremendous military power. It continues to grow. But I want to remind people that the United States, again, has this global spanning military, and the plans, the policies that they are putting into place and what they are actually physically preparing for is not to fight China and defeat it on its own territory or along its shores. It wants to create a conflict, raise the cost for China, and then also use any conflict as an excuse to cut off Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. They are putting the pieces into place to do this. And Danny, you were talking about this CSIS war game. I don't know if you mentioned it during the show, but before we went live, you were talking about CSIS, one of these corporate-funded think tanks. They were talking about wargaming, a Chinese blockade of their own island province of Taiwan, and all the different things that could happen. And one of the outcomes was the U.S. able to use that as a pretext to isolate China diplomatically, politically, economically. And that is, they will provoke this war. Whether they win it or not doesn't matter. They will use that as the pretext to cut Chinese maritime shipping, to isolate China in all of the ways that it has tried to isolate Russia. And I see people in the comment section confused about whether I'm saying the U.S. will win or not. I'm not saying that they're going to win or not win. I'm just saying people should not underestimate them. They are extremely dangerous. And what they lack in military industrial production, they more than make up for in political meddling, subversion, and political capture.
Yeah, and I would say winning is really not the question for the U.S. foreign policy establishment anymore, because it's trying to hold on to an empire. And in many ways, China and Russia have won in so many critical categories. Brian, you mentioned earlier Russia's industrial military production. It's won that. I mean, it's done. That's happened. If the United States can prolong this long enough, maybe they can keep Ukraine and go on to other fronts like Moldova or whatever, and find ways to militarily and politically encircle Russia. But just on the pure facts of military industrial production, Russia has won that, and China economically has already won that. It's really a matter of other than maybe pure GDP terms. But it's really a matter of, for the United States, how can it stop that? And that's what it will do at all costs, maybe to the biggest cost, leading to the biggest cost, which is nuclear conflict, which Donald Trump is openly talking about as if it's a joke, and that is no joke. But I think this is a really good time, actually, since both of you referenced wargaming, China, Taiwan. There is a lot of alarm being spread about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan coming. And here is a Taiwan official, a lot of misreporting going on, but this seems to happen every some odd weeks, where we are told that some Taiwan-based official, this one's called the Deputy Foreign Minister. There's no such thing, but that's what they call themselves, since it is a province of China. But here is what he had to say regarding China and Taiwan.
The population needed not to be naive like the past. China is preparing to invade Taiwan.
If an attack came in the next 18 months, is Taiwan ready? Is Taiwan prepared enough?
Taiwan alone, based on China, we will never be ready. It's not possible. China is so big, so huge. Maybe it's also the tactic of China trying to push Taiwan to the maximum, and then to be very nervous and wanted to become the one who will take the first action or to shut the first.
You think that's right? They're actively trying to provoke a response.
Yeah, we suspect if one day China attack Taiwan, of course, it will be very bad for Taiwan. We will be destroyed.
So not a lot of optimism there, but a lot of blame and demonization of China nonetheless. And this you mentioned, and you've talked about, KJ, Taiwan's recall vote. So this happened twice in the last year. An attempt by the DPP, the Separatist Party, to take back the so-called legislative council. The frustration of this so-called grassroots campaign by the DPP to recall KMT legislators was really horrific. In July 26th, the first recall vote occurred actually in July 26th, and none of them, the KMT legislators, which is the Nationalist Party, which fled to the Taiwan island after 1949, were recalled, and they are for, of course, One China, which is a thorn in the side of the U.S.-backed separatists. So before I get to the war games part of this, KJ, your reaction to the hype and the continual hype of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I mean, the first thing to point out is that it's not possible for a country to invade itself. Taiwan is part of China. It's a province of China. This is recognized by Chinese law. It's recognized by the Taiwan authorities' own constitution. Certainly, it's recognized by the United States, recognized by all the countries of the world. It's recognized by the United Nations. Taiwan is not a country. It is a province of China. It's a province that has pretensions to being something that it is not. It's very similar to the United States. The United States had a civil war. As the Civil War was coming to a close, the Confederates, they decamped and they escaped to Galveston Island off of Texas, and they were regrouping there. And if we can imagine the hypothetical where China had said to the Confederate Army decamped on Galveston Island, yes, you are the United States, and we will arm you and we will support you until you can take back the entirety of the United States. That's essentially what happened. It's a rump state masquerading as a country. And China, even so, has said that it does not want to wage war. It wants peaceful reunification. And essentially, China's great superpower is patience. It's willing to wait decades, if not hundreds of years, until Taiwan falls back into the fold, which I believe it will. But the problem is the United States. The United States has been weaponizing Taiwan. It's been using it as a forward military base. In fact, you can track the history of U.S. relationships with China through phases of Taiwan's history. From 1949 until the mid-70s, Taiwan was a U.S. forward military base on which the U.S. actually parked nuclear weapons and was constantly threatening China. It went from being a military base into a kind of a U.S. hedge, and that was the second phase of U.S.-China relations, which was essentially détente. We're talking about, the 3 communiques and, Nixon and Kissinger in China, etc. The third phase, and during this period, Taiwan was used as a hedge, but it was not used overtly to wage war against China, but it was used as a way of subcontracting for dirty wars. And so, for example, the kind of dirty wars that the US was waging that were too dirty to be done on the books, even for the CIA, would be subcontracted to Taiwan Island. And then the Taiwan would, for example, engage in, they would train death squads in Latin America. The civil air transport, which is Taiwan's international carrier, was also called Air America. So they were used to smuggle drugs out of the Golden Triangle to fund dirty wars through Myanmar against China. And also Taiwan was used as a kind of a global clearinghouse for global fascism. It, supported Israel. It supported South Africa. When Israel was helping South Africa get the nuclear bomb, Taiwan was, major purchaser of uranium from South Africa. In fact, it contracted for 2,000 tons of uranium because they were all going to, turn themselves into nuclear states, and so on and so on. So it has been a bad actor throughout, and it's like a pawn which is posed on the 8th row of the chessboard. That is, you cannot ignore it because it poses an imminent threat. Certainly, if it's used as a gambit, then it has to be taken out immediately. So that's the threat. And this is what the United States is trying to do with Taiwan. It's been Ukrainizing it, for the past 5 years. And it's been trying to use it as a trigger to force China into some kind of kinetic response or even a blockade, and then to use that as a casus belli with which to pile on against China. It's as if, you're constantly on the basketball court, you're constantly driving into the paint and you're trying to draw the foul with the hope that once the foul is drawn, you can get everybody stirred up and everybody will come down from the bleachers and get into a huge fight. And that's essentially Elbridge Colby's strategy, what he calls strategy of denial. Essentially, use Taiwan to trigger a war, get all your allies to pitch in, and then have, a massive war against China. So all of this is so deeply and intricately set up. And, they've been doing this, or they've been, Elbridge Colby is talking about this for over a decade. But this is the situation, which is so extraordinarily hair-trigger dangerous. And most recently, what the DPP did was something very similar to what Korea did. It knows that if it wants to trigger war, the vast majority of people on Taiwan Island are opposed to war. They want nothing to do with war because, everybody in China is their family. Literally, they're related by blood. They're essentially, 95% of the population have relatives in Fujian or China. They don't want to kill their own families. And so in order to make this happen, Taiwan has passed a series of regulations, among which are a kind of bringing back of military rule or martial courts, military courts, in order to, have this kind of arbitrary capacity to shape action inside the country. And then they were trying to get rid of the opposition legislature, which is opposed to war, and essentially have a legislative coup so that they essentially have a unitary government. Now, this is parallel to what was happening in Korea, because, again, Korea is the other big flashpoint. Historically, Taiwan and Korea have always come together. They've always happened at the same time, at least 3 times in history. Anytime there's been an invasion of China, the 2 on-ramps have been Taiwan Island and the Korean Peninsula. But Korea just recently barely escaped a military coup. Yoon Suk-yeol was dead set on triggering a military coup in South Korea, and among his plans, he was going to trigger war with North Korea. We know this, with great certainty at this point, that the plan was to trigger war with North Korea by sending drones and lobbing missiles and doing all and creating, and killing off, South Korean legislators and blaming it on North Korean spies. And by triggering a war with North Korea, then South Korea would have reverted to a military dictatorship, and the US would have taken operational control over South Korea's 500,000 regular troops and 3.1 million reserve troops. That's extraordinary, military manpower that they would have then automatically assumed for their, military purposes. That was thwarted by the people rising up and, overthrowing and impeaching Yoon Suk-yeol, and who's now, facing charges of sedition and treason. But just before Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law, his chief of military intelligence went to Taiwan Island to coordinate with them. And the moment the military martial law was declared, Taiwan DPP government started to praise it in the media. And so you can see that it was a kind of coordinated plan. And once again, as I say, this harkens back to this period when Taiwan and South Korea and the Philippines and South Africa and Israel were this kind of global axis of pariah states that were the clearinghouse for global fascism as subcontractors to US imperial designs. That situation looks to be coming back. The most, striking example is the pager attack on Lebanon, which was done through a Taiwanese company, Gold Apollo, which made the pagers. They said they didn't. They say we just licensed our brand. But what company licenses its brand without doing any quality control, without knowing what its brand is being used for? They said, we don't know anything what happened. But they have never shown any contracts. They've never shown, what the exact agreement was. And why would you take a company, spend decades building up, and then simply traffic out your brand without doing any quality control, unless this was a highly coordinated intelligence operation, which everything seems to signal. That is a highly coordinated intelligence operation using Taiwan in its old role as a proxy for U.S. and the axis of fascist dirty wars.
Yeah, and Brian, before we get to the war games by CSIS recently conducted, very related, it seems, to this reaction by the separatists themselves of a coming invasion from China. What's your reaction first?
Well, I think KJ brought up a lot of really good points, and I think Taiwan is a perfect example of the power of American political capture and the way it's able to take an entire population and turn it against its own best interests and against its own survival, the physical survival. We were just listening to that man play acting as I think he was calling himself a minister of foreign affairs, something like that. He's talking
deputy
about
foreign minister. Yes, that's
yes. He's talking about we might get destroyed. Has he read the U.S. policy papers that say yes, definitely Taiwan is going to get destroyed in any sort of war, and if China doesn't destroy the infrastructure and the industry on Taiwan, the United States itself will destroy it to deny it from falling into the hands of the rest of China. Did he read any of that? Does he look in the news and see what is happening to Ukraine right now at this time? And so obviously he knows all of these things. He doesn't care because he knows that when this happens, in his mind, he thinks, well, I'll just leave. Doesn't matter to me. It'll be all of these ordinary people that are stuck with the consequences, my complicity in this U.S. agenda. He will be in the United States or in Europe. And if we look at the history of the U.S. capturing nations, coups, failed coups, these people stay in the country for as long as they can, and then when time is up, usually they will go back to the US or Europe or wherever they were prepared, and that's where they will return. So this is a huge problem. And Taiwan is right off the coast of the rest of China, and yet China still has a problem trying to win over the information space, the education system, and the island province of Taiwan is dependent on the rest of China for its economy, its economic survival. And yet they're still struggling to do this. So this is a huge weakness, I think, of multipolarism. BRICS, the SCO, all of these groups, ASEAN, they for some reason, they don't really seem to understand. I think China understands, within mainland China, they understand information space is a national security domain. Russia obviously understands this, but their ability to help other nations in, say, BRICS, or nations that aspire to join BRICS, their ability to help nations defend information space as a national security domain is almost non-existent. I don't see any cooperation or any progress in this matter. And this is what allows the United States to get into a country and turn it against its own best interests and the best interests of multipolarism. And if you cannot do that, it doesn't matter how much military equipment you can produce every day, every month, every year. If a country does not have people willing to take up that equipment or will not point it in the right direction, then it's all for nothing. So this is something I think people need to concentrate more on. Multipolarism, the leaders of multipolarism, and we as individuals need to pay more attention to this.
Yeah. Well, the complications of China putting into its foreign policy information sharing, information technology sharing, all of this requires two to tango. And I think that's where the development of BRICS and multipolarity is really going to have to move forward on, which is the fact that there is, I think, a big move toward developing in all kinds of areas of economic and political, diplomatic, even military cooperation. But what you're talking about, Brian, requires a kind of shared vision that is still contested in the world. It is still very much contested of what that vision should be, what multipolarity should look like beyond win-win economic cooperation and economic growth, as important as that is, it's critical. I wanted, though, to play this video from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a State Department funded think tank. They recently wargamed a particular crisis that Taiwan is supposedly going to face and will face if it engages in a US-backed war with China. And it's going to be playing on, I believe, faster speed. It's a couple minutes long. So here we go.
Chinese blockade of Taiwan could trigger the greatest convoy battle since World War II. China would squeeze Taiwan's imports to force a surrender. Taiwan and its supporters, like the United States, would lose dozens of ships to keep supplies flowing. Blockade is not inevitable, but it is possible given China's rhetoric and military buildup. To understand how a blockade might play out, CSIS conducted 26 war games, ranging from low-level boarding and seizure to full-scale conventional conflict. Against boarding and seizure, Taiwan's forces could buy time, but China's massive military would eventually overwhelm them. A Ukraine strategy, where the United States provided support but no troops, did poorly, because it was so hard for shipments to get through without U.S. forces. Mid-intensity war games involved convoy battles. Sometimes the United States and Taiwan could keep Taiwan supplied, but at the cost of dozens, even hundreds of ships. 2 of the 5 free-play games escalated to high-intensity conventional conflict. Many game participants looked for ways around risky sea supply, remembering the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949.
I just want to apologize to all the viewers for the music of this video. It's very cringy, and it was impossible for me to. I tried to take it off, but let's continue.
However, Taiwan has 10 times the population. Even a massive airlift could provide only 2% of Taiwan's daily needs. Submarines and small craft could provide even less support. For China, a blockade risks heavy losses, a long war, and alienating the global community. The Berlin blockade led to the creation of NATO. China might engender a similar response. Every country on the planet would be affected because a blockade would disrupt international trade. Beyond strategy, economics, and logistics, the human cost of war would be staggering. It's a conflict that must be deterred. The question is, how? Taiwan can take steps to gain control of its cargo fleet in the event of an emergency, continue to build energy resilience, and sustain its last nuclear power plant. The United States must maintain its regional alliances and partnerships and develop off-ramps to give China a face-saving way out of a conflict. For the full CSIS report.
So, KJ, to you, your reaction to this report. Actually, let me just pull it up one more time because I wanted to show something in particular that was quite interesting. Let me just rewind here. Allies. I don't know if anyone can catch that flag, the rising sun flag, as part of the Allies. Let's just say that's a huge nod to Imperial Japan, fascist Japan. Anyway, I just found that to be a very interesting little visual reference there that they use. But to you, KJ, your assessment of this war games, these war games are happening all the time from think tanks like CSIS.
Yeah, just before I go that, let me a few words about the rising sun. Anybody who grew up in Asia knows that the rising sun is like the Nazi Hakenkreuz. You see it immediately. It brings together associations of unbridled genocidal violence. At one point, the Japanese marched down the Champs-Élysées, and the rising sun is the military banner. The Japanese national flag itself, is just a circle with a red. It's a white flag with a red circle on it. But the rising sun with those tentacles spreading out, is still the war banner of the Japanese military. And the Japanese were invited to, France, the Champs-Élysées, to to parade with the French, and they brought the rising sun with them. And I and a group of people, we wrote to the French president and said, you've just broken French law, because French law says that you cannot display these kinds of symbols in public, and anybody who does that, has to be fined or arrested. And the French government actually responded, and they said, we apologize. They essentially came up with an apology. But this points out how extraordinarily triggering and how extraordinarily disrespectful it is to fly that. It really is the banner of genocide. For China alone, the Japanese killed somewhere between 27 to 35 million Chinese. That rising sun, the military, the Japanese military flying the rising sun, made the Nazis look like Boy Scouts, and I'm not exaggerating. So anyway, that's an entire different topic. But yes, these CSIS exercises are a message to China. What we do know is that if the United States were to engage in any kind of conventional battle over Taiwan Island with China, it would lose. And there are many reasons for this, but the key reason is, first, the tyranny of distance. The United States is thousands of miles away. The second piece is that Taiwan is a small island. Much as they would like to Ukrainize it, the difficulty is that it's an island, which means that it can be easily blockaded. Ukraine is large landmass with multiple borders, with multiple NATO states, so they've been able to, keep the supply lines going. But Taiwan is an island. And if it were blockaded, it has about 10 days of natural gas and a few weeks of coal and oil. And after that, it would essentially die from energy starvation. And so what CSIS is doing, and they do this every few months, every 6 months, every year, they come up with new exercises. And what they try and do is they try and massage the military exercises, the war game, simulation, to show that the United States can win this war, that it can prevail, and that it will, exert tremendous, damages to China. And as I said, this is a signal to China. They're saying to the Chinese, look, we can win this war. Don't even think about it. The second is they're sending a signal to themselves, saying, yes, we can win this war. Whatever Lyle Goldstein, who really knows the situation, is wrong. Lyle Goldstein says, don't even go there. It is our war to lose. We would have our rear end kicked, in 3 seconds flat. And he's been studying it for 25 years. He knows what he's talking about. But CSIS, wants to put forth the neocon aggressive agenda that, this is a war that we can win and that they can deter a Chinese aggression. When they say deter, of course, it means to provoke, because that's ultimately what they want. As Elbridge Colby has said, the strategy of denial is really a matter of driving into the paint, provoking China, and then getting everybody else to pile on. And so CSIS is always doing this. CSIS is a think tank. It's like the CFR, or Center for New American Security. It's one of these incredibly hawkish think tanks who started by Henry Kissinger. And their message always is that, even though it seems like a war that is ours to lose, yes, here is the pathway to win. And by doing so, we send a message to US allies. Yes, you have to join us and make sure you get into the fight. Sends a message to China. We're serious about waging war, even though we have to lie through our teeth through these fake simulations that are so full of ridiculous assumptions that, you kind of have to, it's just a package of lies. And then it's also a message to themselves. Yes, we can do this. It's a kind of a self-affirmation. Yes, we can win this war. Yes, US can win this war because CSIS said so. So it's thoroughly shot through with stupidity and corruption, but it's also a very, very dangerous signal, because it shows that they're putting a lot of money and effort into thinking through how they can wage this war and both signal that they can win it, but also think, tactically, strategically, operationally. These are the things that we actually have to prepare in order to go to war.
Yeah, and a lot of this, Brian, has been in response to the fact that China has simulated. They have not actively, maybe a quote unquote blockade, but they have simulated quite intense naval drills following what they see as illegal visits by so-called Taiwan officials, either visits from U.S. officials to Taiwan, like Nancy Pelosi a few years back, or of course the Kevin McCarthy visit. I think that was last year, or was it the year before that? Either way, there have been visit after visit of so-called U.S. and Taiwan officials, and that's what usually sparks this, or weapons transfers. But Brian, what do you make of the results of what CSIS says, and anything else you want to comment on with regard to this particular war games? Because I know you follow these think tanks quite closely.
Yes, I agree with KJ. I don't think the United States would win this, but is that necessarily their objective? Do they want to provoke? Because that's what they're doing. They're provoking a war over Taiwan. They're doing it by the way, they're doing it in violation of their own recognition of the One China policy, which is also upheld under international law. Taiwan is part of China, according to everybody. I mean, even people who don't recognize the One China policy, what they recognize instead is the administration on the island province of Taiwan as the government of all of China. Nobody on planet Earth recognizes Taiwan as an independent country. No one, not a single country, not that I know of. But I want to point out something that that video pointed out. They said, if this happened, if China tried to implement a blockade of the island province of Taiwan, it would alienate China, and that means politically and economically. And then they talk about the blockade of Berlin that triggered the creation of NATO, and this could create another organization like NATO, an Asian NATO essentially, which is something they're already trying to build. And because they can't build it, they're trying to extend NATO's mandate over to Asia. And we've been talking, all of us have been talking about this for the last couple of years. This was going on under probably the first Trump administration, all throughout the Biden administration, and it continues to this day. So what they want to do is provoke China into implementing this blockade, or reacting in some way where they can make a case to isolate China economically, politically, diplomatically, and also coerce nations into picking a side. Are you going to pick what? Just think about the the day after Russia went into Ukraine in 2022, February 2022. And all of these nations were put on a spot. Are you going to side with us, or are you going to side with Russia? And nobody sided with Russia. There were many countries that backtracked from that later. But at that moment, everybody was coerced into siding with the United States. They're going to do the exact same thing when they provoke this conflict with China over the status of Taiwan. And that is going to be the impetus that they use to work on these other strategies they're working on. So no, they're not going to try to fight and win a war against China. They'll try to make any fight that takes place as costly as possible for China. They have said in policy paper after policy paper, including CSIS in previous reports, that the island province will be scoured of industry and infrastructure. There will be nothing left. Whether they win or they don't win, it doesn't matter. That will all be gone. But what they really want to do is this bigger picture encirclement and containment of China that they really can't put in place with tariffs and with the hybrid warfare that they've been using all the way up until now. Although that all continues to ramp up, all of that will accelerate exponentially if this were to happen. That's the actual game the U.S. is playing at, and CSIS is just reflecting something that the establishment has been working on and putting the pieces into place for years and years up until now. I always bring this up. Under the Biden administration, the entire Marine Corps was reconfigured. All of their tanks that they had been using for decades and decades in conflicts all around the world, they got rid of those, and now they are strictly a maritime interdiction force. They are meant to interdict maritime forces or shipping. That is their purpose now. And that is what they are now, under the Trump administration, training to do in the Asia-Pacific region. And so if this conflict were to take place, they would use the Marine Corps to interdict Chinese maritime shipping and also naval forces. The U.S. Air Force is practicing dispersing their forces to fight China and prevent China from overwhelming a handful of U.S. air bases. Now there are many more air bases China would be required to hit and constantly hit to keep them out of operation. And so this is what is shaping up. A lot of people think the United States isn't going to go to war with China, but they're already at proxy war with Russia. They already fought open war with Iran. This is coming. I always point out the people behind these policies, they are immune from the consequences. Everybody else will pay the consequences. Everyone in Asia will pay. The American people will pay. America's armed forces will pay. These people will be the last people on earth that will pay the consequences. Until that calculus changes, their mindset is going to remain locked in this direction. As KJ said, they only go forward. They never reverse gear. If they go into neutral, it's just so they can go forward again.
Yeah. And I want to now finally, given all that we've talked about here, I want to bring up just something for because I do think that when it comes to these war games, when it comes to this aggression toward China, toward Russia, we are seeing, I think, some headway in terms of a response, of a real response that doesn't get much attention, but when it does, it's usually Western media hype. And so I wanted to actually pull up what China and Russia are doing right now. They are holding joint naval drills off of Vladivostok, and according to U.S. military sources, China is sending submarine to Russia during these exercises for the first time, and that's according to Army recognition. The Chinese flotilla includes a Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine originally built in Russia, as well as two Type 52D class guided missile destroyers, the Xiaoxing and Urumqi, which is not unironically the capital of Xinjiang. And then I want to pull up why Russia and China might be getting more militarily involved with each other. So some may know the big monopoly Palantir, a huge supporter of the Trump administration, especially J.D. Vance, who comes out of that ilk, comes out of this corporation. So Palantir just recently received a $10 billion contract from the U.S. military, U.S. Army, the Defense Department in order to take care of the software and data analysis of the U.S. military. And for those who aren't familiar with Palantir in the realm of geopolitics, it's really, I think, noteworthy to note that its founder, Palantir's Alex Karp, says that the U.S. is going to very likely fight a three-front war against Russia and China. He said this last year in 2024, that Russia, China, and Iran are going to be the targets of U.S. war. And it just so happens that this gentleman is one of the biggest donors to the military-industrial complex and one of the biggest forces in the military-industrial complex itself. So I wanted to raise that, KJ, in the overall context of what we've been talking about, but your reaction to this?
So this is how the United States thinks that it's going to win the war. First, it's going to win in the digital domain, which, as I said over and over again, and I agree with Brian, digital sovereignty is key because the US excels in digital coups. And China is actually helping the Global South build out digital sovereignty through the digital Silk Road. This was what Huawei was doing when the United States went after Huawei and they actually kidnapped their CFO. So this shows you, that the stakes are very, very high, and both parties are aware that, this is the case. But the thing to understand about Palantir and all the other AI companies is that they have been inducted into war. They're part of the military industrial AI system that the United States thinks it can leverage to win a war. Why do they think that? Well, the genesis of AI itself started in military purposes. One part of it was so that the United States could continue fighting after life had been wiped out, that you had automated, like the dead hand, that you had automated battle management where, missiles could continue to be fired even after human life had been wiped out. That was actually explicit in the early, vision of AI. And then the other piece of it is, it's what we refer to as generative AI right now, all the stuff that we see with LLMs, etc. All of that comes out of neural networks. Neural networks were originally based on a model of the brain called the perceptron. It was a kind of digital or digital analog model of the brain that simulated what scientists thought the neurons did. It was simulating the patterns of the retina. And the original perceptron built in the 1950s was to accelerate recognition and targeting for military purposes. And that genesis and that DNA continues to this day. So you saw all the accelerated targeting done by Palantir through Where's Daddy and Lavender, which they used to accelerate the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. So this application of AI for war is very, very concrete. It's already happening. And it ties into the larger model of war, which the US has been using or planning against China, which is, as I said, the 3Ds, diffusion, dispersion, and distribution, which Brian has pointed out, you can see in the agile combat formations that the Marines are rehearsing. Also, another dimension is disguise. So these disguised attacks, the Lebanon pager attack, the Internet of Dangerous Things, the attack on Russia. These are ways of using disguise. And another form of disguise or subterfuge is subsurface warfare. So using submarines. Submarines will be a large part of the war doctrine, as well as diffused, dispersed, and distributed long-range fires. And then another dimension of the third offset is autonomy. So having autonomous fighting platforms platforms that are AI powered. This is very, very large part of what the United States is currently trying to develop. They want to see if they can use AI to accelerate military advantage in order to destroy China on the battlefield. And so Palantir, is one of the key players, as is Palmer Luckey and Oculus, and they're all involved. They're all involved in feeding at the trough on this AI-enabled war racket that they're trying to drum up. And of course, Alex Karp is especially dangerous. They all are, because they really all are, and I say this with all seriousness, they all are insane. But not only are they insane, they don't know what they're doing. Alex Karp doesn't have a background in engineering. He actually has a degree in classics. So, really, this is the kind of ultimate white Western supremacist discipline that is all about maintaining class. That's what classics is about. It's about maintaining, privilege and class. And giving markers of it based on, Western, Western texts. But anyway, he really is a rabid xenophobe who doesn't know what he's doing, but is deeply indoctrinated and has, deeply inhaled, the anti-China hatred. And at the same time, he is this, I think, neurodiverse, rabid militarist. And it's people like Karp and Peter Thiel and Palmer Luckey that are saying that they are going to create the killer app that is going to destroy China. And they believe, they say this over and over again. Every day I wake up, Palmer Luckey says, every day I wake up and think about how am I going to destroy my enemies, and then, names China for it. So we have, this kind of policy which is driven by this infernal fascist enmeshing of militarized corporations and rabid neocons with an agenda to destroy China and to maintain white Western supremacy, hegemony. And I think this is what makes this moment so dangerous. And of course, they're breaking every single law in the book. Just a sidebar comment. If the United States were ever to get involved in a war over Taiwan, it would be considered a war of aggression, because foreign interference in a civil war, which is what this is a violation of international law. So the US would be actually engaging in a war of aggression against China, and then we'd have all the crises in the UN and international law as well. So,
yeah, Brian. To this question, what do you see as the importance of, to the other side of this, Russia and China's increasing military cooperation, but overall this partnership, the importance of it, given that there is a literal agenda from the most powerful forces, the Palantir, Peter Thiel, Alex Karp. These are powerful monopolists who literally dictate U.S. foreign policy. There's an agenda against both of them, and then we can throw in Iran there too as the pillars of multipolarity. What do you see as the importance of this increasing cooperation, especially among the heads, as the U.S. State Department, the Department of Defense would see it, the heads of the multipolar snake, which is Russia and China?
As well, they have to cooperate militarily. They not only need to demonstrate their own ability to deter Western encroachment and aggression, but they have to work together to amplify this deterrent. And, again, that is necessary. They need to do that, and the more, the better. But the problem is there's many other areas they definitely need to work on. And we talked about the digital Silk Road a little bit earlier. And yes, they were building out the physical infrastructure, 5G. And yes, we saw the United States very actively go out against that. But what they need to do is a digital Silk Road in terms of the flow of information, social media platforms. Again, the U.S. is dangerous militarily and economically, but again, it's absolute most successful and effective superweapon is its ability to politically capture targeted nations. And if, just for example, we're on YouTube right now, and someone like me, if I want to talk to people around the world, even if I want to talk to people in outside of the West, I still need to use social media platforms completely controlled by the United States, by Silicon Valley, by these billionaires, by these corporations that are driving US foreign policy. And why has Russia, China, and other nations in the multipolar world allowed this to persist for so long? They have their own domestic, Russia, China, a couple of other countries have created their own domestic social media platforms for their people to secure their information space. But there is nothing that binds the multipolar world together, something that is out of reach of the collective West to manipulate and censor the algorithm. Manipulating the algorithm on Facebook, Meta, before Twitter, now X, YouTube. This is part of gaining control of people's minds, winning them over, shaping their ideology, shaping what they think their best interests are, to the point where they are actually working against their own survival, their own peace, stability, and prosperity. And so I think, yes, it's good that they're cooperating militarily, and they need to do more of that urgently. And maybe that's why they're doing this first, because it is so urgent. But they also need to work in these other areas. It's so important. And KJ was talking about AI and how the collective West wants to leverage AI as a force multiplier. They understand that on the battlefield, face to face with Russia or China or Iran, they will lose. So they're trying to use AI to give them an advantage. And they think in their mind, this will enable them to fight these other nations in the same way that the conquistadors used metal armor and firearms against locals who just had, they were basically shirtless and they had bows and arrows and spears. This is what in their mind, they want to create that sort of military disparity between themselves and these nations they want to subjugate. So we have to keep a close eye on all of these realms, not just the military battlefields, military production, but these other areas where maybe it's a bit even, because yes, China and Russia are working on AI. And then in other areas like controlling information space, where the US still holds supremacy.
Yeah, KJ, comment on this, because one of the big issues here is that Russia and China and the multipolar world, of course, the military cooperation is necessary, and Russia and China and Iran, really, those are the three pillars of the multipolar world that are able to and are engaging in increasing that cooperation and strengthening each other. But on the other hand, it's difficult to compete with a rabid empire that's willing to invest everything into what Brian is talking about, this information weapon, using information as a weapon, when China, Russia, Iran have to be, in order for them to exist, have to be attuned to the needs of their own people. And then, of course, the needs of a multipolar world that might come first, as Brian even referenced, right? Maybe defense, security, and then, of course, economic development, which if you don't have that, you're not going to have much support for it. So, KJ, your comments on this situation?
It's a very difficult situation. I've said this before, but the United States it's like somebody in a school shooter mode. I mean, the other people, they just want to go about their life, take their classes, go about normally. And the US is in a school shooter mode. So how do you deal with it? Do you tackle them? Do you go after them? Do you hide? Do you evade? This is the question of our moment, is how do you disarm? How do you diffuse the school shooter without getting everybody killed? And of course, as we've said before, digital sovereignty is a very, very important part of it. I've said that, what everybody needs to do is they need to consider that mental space is a warfighting domain, and they have to make sure that their minds are not occupied, because that is literally what is happening. They have to reclaim their own minds, prevent their minds from being colonized and turned into bots for, the propagation of, weaponized propaganda. the US has been doing this for a very long time. As I said, US invented marketing, and it invented public relations. It invented the revival tent and religious fanaticism inside Protestantism. So it's been doing this for a long time. It's very good at this. And, even more directly, Stanford University has been teaching courses on digital coups, how to, coup countries through digital means for about 25 years. It's been done by a guy called Larry Diamond, who's one of the leaders, or the eminence grise, the gray cardinal of the NED. And Amy Goodman gets him on her show she gets him on her show, and she never reveals that this guy is, he's the gray cardinal of the NED. But digital sovereignty is key. So we have to understand that. And then the other thing that we also can place a little bit of hope on, once again, we have to be careful. You can't be too optimistic. You can't be too pessimistic. You have to find that Goldilocks zone. Do not be arrogant, because, the one on the right was damned, do not despair. The one on the left was saved, etc. So we have to walk a very, very fine line, but we have to understand that, currently the empire is eating itself from within. As I said, the four horsemen: deindustrialization, financialization, hyper-financialization. It simply wants to claim rents off of everything, of which Peter Thiel is one of these people. He knows that the entire system is corrupt and broken, but he wants to see if he can, grab and loot while it is still working. So hyper-financialization is a problem. And then we have the problem of de-skilling. The US can no longer build things. Not only can it not build things industrially, but actually it doesn't really have the capacity to do meaningful cognitive labor anymore. Most of the cognitive labor is done through cognitive sweatshops that have been outsourced to, the global South. And one example of this is most of the AI researchers are actually Chinese. Over 50% of the top AI researchers are Chinese. Mark Zuckerberg, created this AI dream team. I think most of them are Chinese. And so essentially, what this boils down to is, if we think of war as being not simply a matter of logistics or industry or strategy or tactics, but we think of it as a kind of a contest of learning curves, then the US is way behind on that learning curve. It has, left every child's behind. In particular, AI itself is simply applied math. People think that, AI is something magical. No, it's just math. Computer science is just applied math. And when you have a math contest, the US doesn't come out ahead, because the US leadership is a leadership led by lawyers, and most lawyers don't do math. Certainly Peter, Alex Karp, I don't believe that he can do, math worth, anything. So in a math contest, when you have the mathematicians fighting the lawyers, I think the mathematicians are going to come out ahead. And we see this with things like DeepSeek, where simply they took the AI algorithms and improved them without having to increase compute. So I think that China will eventually pull ahead in AI, in particular in embodied AI. And that's where the industrial capacity also ties into the AI development and the large language models, because ultimately intelligence is a matter of inhabiting the world and being able to navigate the world. And in order to do that, you need industrial capacity with industrial robots that have autonomy, that can learn in their interactions with the world around them, that knowledge is considered as this entire world and its interactions and connections. And in that sense, China has the advantage, whereas the US is just barely doing its coding and trying to, run up some kind of advantage with massive amounts of compute and, advanced chips. And even those are starting to be overtaken by China. So ultimately, time is on China's side. Time is on the side of the global South. And essentially, we can say that the superpower of the global south is patience. So if we can just avoid war over the next 2 to 5 years, then I think the disparities will be so big that the chances of war will be significantly diminished. But we just have to get through this, dark tunnel, this dark night of aggression, which is very, very thick and dark and frightening at the current moment.
Yeah, and in about a minute or 2 minutes or less or so for both of you, if possible, just your final analysis on how I kind of sum things up to see is that on the one hand, you have the danger that you bring up, Brian. Certainly, the U.S. empire is not out, even if it is down. It is very dangerous, and I believe its desperation and its decline lead it to taking risks or moving toward escalations, which are going to and already are, if Gaza, if Iran, if Lebanon, if Ukraine. I mean, all of these wars and conflicts and with Gaza genocide, I mean, the casualty count is just absolutely astonishing. And then there are moves, for example, like the economic war on China, the tariffs, the sanctions on Russia, the war on BRICS that Trump is trying to engender, that have a kind of boomerang effect. I mean, right now, Brian, so I get your comments first, you have Scott Bessent, and not only are they going after Brazil, which is standing really defiant, and Lula is, talking like urging the global south to dump the dollar and to begin to build that mechanism to do that. They're going after India now, which is quite the strategic blunder, in my opinion. But here's what Scott Bessent is saying about negotiations with India.
And also, India's been a large buyer of sanctioned Russian oil that they then resell as refined products. So, they have not been a great global actor. So
India is supposed to be the proxy for the U.S. against China. It's supposed to do its bidding on the foreign policy realm. And the Trump administration has been going after essentially anybody and everybody on this. And essentially the positive I see in this moment is that if there is this common vision that I think is needed for a BRICS and a multipolar world, certainly the U.S.'s own actions could help facilitate that. But Brian, your final comments, and then KJ.
I think KJ made a really good point. He's talking about the multipolar world and how time is working in its favor, and how patience and the ability to avoid a major war that will burn everything down that everyone is working so hard to build up, that is central. And if the multipolar world can make it through these next couple of years, then there will be this disparity between the rest of the world and the West and its vision of reasserting itself. But the problem is the United States right now, we can see examples of this right now where they just don't care anymore about pretexts, an excuse to go to war. They were literally negotiating. Iran was negotiating with the U.S., which they had no reason to negotiate with the U.S. The U.S. is not in charge of global nuclear programs, but they were negotiating to avoid a war, and the U.S. just attacked Iran in the middle of negotiations. So they have become so reckless and aggressive, and they're doing things on impulse because they know they're out of time. But this is extremely dangerous. That border conflict was engineered by U.S.-backed political forces on both sides of the border, here in Thailand and in neighboring Cambodia. And then the trade deal was rammed through on both sides while everybody was distracted by the conflict. Nobody had a chance to debate the U.S. trade demands, basically, not a deal. And nobody had any time to protest it. And if you look at the concessions that were forced on Thailand and Cambodia, they're putting 0 tariffs on U.S. products. They still get tariffs from the U.S., 19%, 20%, something like that. And they are being forced to buy LNG, and they're being forced to buy huge amounts of Boeing aircraft that nobody needs. And a lot of these countries use Airbus. And to switch over to another airliner is not like switching over to, I was driving a Kia, now I'm driving an Audi. It's not like that. You have to make huge investments on all of the things that support that aircraft on the ground and in the air. And they also had to make concessions to the US regarding Google and Amazon regarding these digital services and infrastructure that are only going to enhance America's control and ability to project political control over these targeted nations. So this is a huge threat. They're going for everything all at once. They don't care how it looks. They picked Trump on purpose because then they can just say, well, that was Trump. We all know he was crazy and impulsive. That was him. That had nothing to do with what America really stands for. This is what they do with every presidential administration. They flush everything, all responsibility down the toilet every time there's a new administration. Everything else gets flushed down with the previous administration. So this is what they're doing, and they're more dangerous and desperate now than ever. And people have to look at the big picture, not get focused too much on any one conflict, see how they all work together, and see how all of these conflicts work together with the tariffs, with propaganda, with the media, with all of these distractions they try to use to divide us. We have to look at all of it as one single push by the US to reassert itself globally.
Yeah, KJ, your final comments.
Yeah, I've said this before, and I hate to keep repeating myself, but U.S. is like a drunk at the bar, and the bar is closing, and the drunk needs to go home. The credit cards have been rejected, struck out with everybody, and it's just time to go home. But the drunk doesn't want to go home, and they want to fight, and they're willing to fight the entire everybody there. And so this is the dangerous piece. And what it's also doing is it's bullying its sidekicks right now. So you can see that even the countries that are the closest to the United States are getting really, really raw deals because the US decides that it can twist its, quote unquote allies or its vassals the most. And so, it's that situation where the bully, after having bullied everybody but no longer capable of bullying other people, decides to bully their own sidekicks. The best example, as you just pointed out, is India. I've been doing journalism for a long time. We used to call it the Asia Pacific. That was my beat. It was the Asia Pacific. And then sometime around the Biden administration, it became the Indo-Pacific, which is a kind of nonsense term. I mean, it's a 19th century Bismarckian colonial term. But the reason why we started using the term Indo-Pacific, as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is really another rebranded pivot to Asia, is that they wanted India to be the left tackle in this rising Pacific War. Japan, Korea are the right tackle. India is the left tackle. And in order to, make this very, very clear, we're going to call it the Indo-Pacific, and we're going to have an Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, that didn't turn out so well because, India is a big country and it has a kind of, dual alliance. It's very close to Russia. When the war in Ukraine broke out, India decided it was going to continue relations with Russia. It was not going to sanction Russia. And then this put it in the doghouse. And so now it is, being thrashed. And so, the original notion of the Quad, which was Australia, Japan, India, and the US, that has, nobody's talking so much about that anyway. So they want to see if they can thrash India and continue the beatings until the morale improves, until the, imperial vassal mentality improves. But once again, the empire is imploding. The drunk is picking fights everywhere, and they're also sending the message that anything goes. We are crazy. We can do anything. That's the message, really, of Gaza, that there's no limits to our depravity and violence. And so, once again, we have to come back to what can we do? We have to see if we can de-escalate. We have to see if we can get the drunk to calm down, go home, go to sleep. And in the meantime, we also have to make sure that we are not being captured as vectors of propaganda for this incredibly violent but absurd information war that is being waged right now. Just remember, the farther we are from truth, the closer we are to war. Those who tell you absurdities are preparing you for atrocities.
Yeah, and I'll just close on this. I want to thank all the super chats, by the way, and comments here, super stickers, and thanks, Tom, for being a member for so long, and for going to China. That's going to be great. I want to just say that, you know, when it comes to the multipolar war, I've been seeing this commentary more and more so, and it's important, you know, and it's definitely important to be critical. I do want to emphasize, though, the responsibilities that you just outlined, KJ, when it comes to seeing and learning and being committed to the truth, especially in the collective West, that the responsibilities, and I think that's why I appreciate you so much, Brian, for talking about the dangers of the U.S. empire, because it's our responsibility in the collective West, in the United States, wherever we are, to not only speak out about it, but to then stop it. like if we want to see things like multipolarity flourish, if we want to see Russia, China, Iran not be beleaguered and embattled in constant, endless wars, they can't necessarily control that. They're not going to. They're not seeking to overthrow the Washington, establishment. That's just not how reality works. The United States, people here, people in the West, they have to be the ones committed to their own process of political development, so that and put action to the truth that they are awoken to, so that so that we don't have to deal with genocides in Gaza, regional wars, nuclear war, all of this that we talk about here. It is to impart that responsibility on those who have the most of it. So with all that said, everybody, this was a great conversation. I'll be back again this week, probably a couple of times, actually, as we enter the week. Thanks for joining on a Sunday. It is early Monday morning for Brian, and it is late Sunday evening for both KJ and I. So we are going to head out of here together. Hit the like button before you go. I have put both Brian's YouTube channel as well as KJ Knows, the China Report on Breakthrough News, in the video description, so you all can take a look at them. Hit the like button before you go. That helps boost the stream after it is done. And then, of course, you can find all the places to support this work: Patreon, Substack, and so much more. Until we meet again next time, everybody, have a good one. Take care and bye-bye.